With tensions running high in the South China Sea over territorial rights, the new standard map that will counter China's 10-line map is crucial in terms of determining the extent of Philippine territory that is free for safe navigation and implementing environmental protection programs, according to the Armed Forces of the Philippines. This is the first time the Philippine government will publish an updated map showing the country's maritime entitlements, 7 years after the United Nations-backed arbitration tribunal ruled some rock features in the Spratlys form part of the Philippines' EEZs. The Philippines National Security Council will publish an updated Philippine map highlighting the country's maritime entitlements is underway in line with the 2016 arbitral ruling and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Conversely, China rejected the decision as illegal, null, and void and therefore without any binding effect on itself. Other countries, including the United States, Vietnam, Australia, and Japan, backed the Philippines and called on China to respect the tribunal's decision. Beijing claims indisputable sovereignty over almost all of the South China Sea, and most of the islands and sandbars within it, including many features that are hundreds of miles from mainland China. The Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei and Taiwan also hold competing claims. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said the shoal and its adjacent waters are China's inherent territory, and therefore Beijing has indisputable sovereign rights in the disputed waters. The Chinese claims are mostly based on its historical rights during the Han Dynasty, dating back over 2,000 years ago. In modern history, China backed its sovereignty claim and related rights over this territory in accordance with the 1943 Cairo Declaration and the 1945 Potsdam Proclamation. After World War II, Japan returned to China the Chinese territories it had occupied, including Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, the Chisha Islands, and the Nansha Islands. However, the 2016 arbitral tribunal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea invalidated China's historical claims over the disputed waters of the South China Sea. The tribunal dealt with the question of whether China's claims to historic rights within the 9-line, now 10-line were in conformity with UNCLOS. It was first observed that this area, in which China claimed rights, formed in the long historical course, to living and non-living resources like fisheries and petroleum resources, partially overlaps with areas that would otherwise comprise the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf of the Philippines. In the view of the tribunal, UNCLOS establishes a comprehensive maritime zones regime and allocates rights in these areas to the coastal state and other states. In the areas of the EEZ and the continental shelf, the coastal state enjoys exclusive sovereign rights to the exploitation of living and non-living natural resources. Concerning the rights of other states in these areas, the tribunal found that UNCLOS does not permit the preservation of the historic rights of any state within the EEZ or the continental shelf of another state. Therefore, after the entry into force of UNCLOS, the historic rights that might have existed for China within the 9-line in areas that would otherwise include the EEZ or the CS of the Philippines were superseded by the maritime zones regime created by UNCLOS. That means the pre-existing historic rights no longer exist as they are not compatible with UNCLOS. Accordingly, the tribunal concluded that China's claims were contrary to UNCLOS and exceeded the geographic limits imposed by it. The award addresses three main substantive issues. First, the so-called 9-line and China's claim to historic rights in the South China Sea. Second, the status of certain maritime features in the South China Sea. And third, the legality of Chinese activities in the South China Sea. Because of jurisdictional limits, however, the arbitral tribunal did not deal with matters related to territorial sovereignty over the disputed maritime features between the parties. That means that the tribunal did not decide who owned the maritime features located in the South China Sea, such as the Spratly Islands, that are claimed by both China and the Philippines or any other coastal state in the region. Similarly, the tribunal did not delimit any maritime boundaries between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. The tribunal also ruled on the legality of the activities of Chinese officials and Chinese vessels in the areas of the South China Sea located within the Philippines' EEZ and continental shelf. It concluded that China breached the provisions of UNCLOS, in particular by temporarily prohibiting fishing in areas of the South China Sea falling within the Philippines' EEZ. Failing to prevent Chinese vessels from fishing in the Philippines' EEZ at Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal, and preventing Filipino fishermen from engaging in traditional fishing at Scarborough Shoal. Regarding China's construction of artificial islands, installations, and structures at Mischief Reef, an LTE that is part of the Philippines' EEZ and continental shelf, Without the authorization of the Philippines, the tribunal also found China to have violated UNCLOS. To counter Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, the Philippines, with lesser economic influence and military power, opened up additional U.S. military bases in the country. As the longest U.S. ally in the region, the Philippines has long been at the forefront of preserving the free and open regional order in Southeast Asia and the greater Indo-Pacific region with the help of U.S. military might. Having increased U.S. access in northern Luzon, the closest Philippine island to Taiwan, really ensured that the Philippines and the U.S. alliance are going to have a front and center role in Northeast Asian security and deterrence. Among the 5 treaty allies that the United States has in Asia, the Philippines and Japan are the most geographically close to Taiwan, with the Philippines' northernmost, inhabited island of Itbayat just 93 miles away. The Philippines archipelago is also a major part of the first island chain, which refers to the first chain of major Pacific archipelagos out from the East Asian continental mainland coast. Currently, the first island chain is the most effective point to counter any Chinese invasion and expanding influence. The tribunal's ruling is certainly a legal victory for the Philippines over China, as the judges agreed unanimously on almost all the questions submitted by the Philippines, including a declaration from the tribunal that China is obliged to comply with UNCLOS and that the award is legally binding on China. There is no enforcement mechanism as such under UNCLOS in the event that China fails to comply with the tribunal's decision, but the Philippines could either resort to diplomatic ways, bilateral or multilateral negotiations within the framework of international organizations, or have recourse to further arbitration under UNCLOS. Moreover, other states and non-state actors could take further actions such as economic sanctions to put pressure on Beijing to shift its behavior. But, beyond China's non-compliance attitude, the award has value for the states bordering the South China Sea and the rest of the international community for 2 reasons. The tribunal's ruling clarified the respective rights and obligations of both China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, thereby facilitating their further relations, and the tribunal's findings might have an impact on policy considerations and decision-making of other states as it clarified important legal issues in UNCLOS. Manila says Beijing continues to send its maritime militia to Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. In the southern portion of the sea is the Spratly Island chain, which Beijing calls the Nansha Islands. The archipelago consists of 100 islets and reefs, of which 45 are occupied by China, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, or the Philippines. In the northwestern part of the sea, the Paracels, known as the Chisha Islands in China, have been controlled by Beijing since 1974 despite claims from Vietnam and Taiwan. China's ruling Communist Party also claims self-governing Taiwan as its own territory, despite having never controlled it. Under President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the Philippines has taken increasingly assertive steps to protect its claim to shoals in the South China Sea, leading to several confrontations with Chinese vessels in waters off the Philippine Islands. They include standoffs between the Chinese Coast Guard and what Manila says are shadowy Chinese maritime militia boats and tiny wooden Philippine fishing vessels, Chinese water cannons blocking the resupply of a shipwrecked Philippine military outpost, and a lone Filipino diver using a knife to sever a massive floating Chinese barrier. These recent incidents in the past year show that China has become increasingly aggressive and confident in its actions against smaller countries like the Philippines. The Philippine Coast Guard says it remains committed to upholding international law, safeguarding the welfare of Filipino fisherfolk, and protecting the rights of the Philippines in its territorial waters. China's foreign ministry has defended the behavior of its vessels in the waterway and said Beijing will firmly safeguard what it views as its territorial sovereignty. Since taking office in 2022, Philippine President Marcos Jr. has taken a stronger stance over the South China Sea than his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte's, amid the wider power struggle that has been playing out in the region for years. The South China Sea is widely seen as a potential flashpoint for global conflict, and the recent confrontations between Manila and Beijing have raised concerns among Western observers of potentially developing into an international incident if China, a global power, decides to act more forcefully against the Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally. Washington and Manila are bound by a mutual defense treaty signed in 1951 that remains in force, stipulating that both sides would help defend each other if either were attacked by a third party. Marcos has strengthened U.S. relations that had frayed under his predecessor, with the two allies touting potential future joint patrols in the South China Sea. Philippine Defense Secretary equated Chinese behavior in the region to that of a schoolyard bully. Recent incidents that have the region on edge include Chinese water cannons blocking the resupply of a shipwrecked Philippine military outpost, and a lone Filipino diver cutting through a floating Chinese barrier. Earlier this year, the Philippine Coast Guard accused a Chinese Coast Guard ship of pointing a military-grade laser at some of its crew, temporarily blinding them. In recent weeks, the Ayungin Shoal has been the target of Chinese efforts to stake its claim on territory to which the Philippines has sovereign rights. Chinese ships have been blockading the entrance to the shoal to ward off attempts to deliver supplies to the military outpost at the atoll. Resupply boats have been playing a deadly cat-and-mouse game with Chinese vessels to preserve the lifeline for the Philippine troops stationed at Ayungin. The harassment by Chinese vessels, which includes firing a water cannon at a Philippine boat, has been documented on video as evidence of the brazen disregard for Philippine sovereignty. Beijing has been unmoved by the close to 100 diplomatic protests filed by Manila and continues to build up its flotilla of military and fishing vessels in the West Philippine Sea. The Philippines recently denounced Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea, in which the China Coast Guard attempted to obstruct the Philippine Coast Guard's resupply mission to BRP Sierra Madre in Ayungin Shoal. Today, China's biggest concern is the presence of the United States in the region. And though China's attempts to form a wider regional security agreement were rebuffed by members of the Pacific Islands Forum, it hasn't given up on the vision of having Chinese military vessels patrolling the South China Sea. Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy operating in the Indo-Pacific routinely shadow Western and Japanese ships operating in the region, particularly in areas where China claims sovereignty such as the South China Sea. The Philippines defense chief is pushing for a swift and sweeping modernization of his country's Navy and Coast Guard to tackle Beijing's aggressive tactics in the disputed South China Sea. The Philippines will carry it out through a comprehensive re-strategization and forging alliances, he told reporters in Manila on Monday during the commissioning of 2 coastal patrol ships donated by the United States. According to U.S. Navy officials, China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea must be challenged. Vice Admiral Carl Thomas assured the Philippines of U.S. backing in the face of shared challenges in the region, saying that the U.S. forces are out here for a reason. The largest of the U.S. Navy's forward-deployed fleets, the 7th Fleet, headquartered in Japan, operates as many as 70 ships, and has around 150 aircraft and more than 27,000 sailors. It operates over an area of 124 million square kilometers from bases in Japan, South Korea, and Singapore.